Hi everyone, I am recording a video lecture on Module 7. This is for fences. And so I first wanted to start out with the discussion that you have for this week on fences. And this is a 20th century play by August Wilson, and our textbook gives some information about the author. But the discussion for this week, you are choosing from these two bullet points in terms of what you want to write about. So the first one asks you to write about a motif. So, and it first explains, like, here's what a motif is and, versus a theme. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about that. And then it gives you some examples of, like, for example, Antigone, suicide is a recurring motif because that's one of the most important things about motif, or what constitutes what a motif is. It's recurrent, whereas a symbol may not recur. It can recur, but it may not always. But a motif is always something that's recurrent. But I'll talk a little bit more at the end after I go over fences. I'll talk about motif versus symbol versus theme, because the symbol also can sometimes be confused with motifs as well. But the question that this first bullet point asks you is, fences also incorporates recurring references, images, and phrases. As discussed in question 1, athletic pursuits are one dominant motif. Identify and explain the significance of another motif. So that's the first one you can choose from. And then the second one asks you to look at the reading by Arthur Miller. And I was happy we weren't reading Arthur Miller, because Death of a Salesman is incredibly depressing. But in Arthur Miller's essay, Tragedy and the Common Man, he argues that tragedy is not pessimistic. So this question asks you to address, why does Miller see tragedy as optimistic, taken as a whole, and then applying that to fences, right? In the context of Miller, or in consideration of what Miller argues in his essay, do you interpret fences as optimistic or pessimistic? So those are the two prompt questions. And then it tells you to do the same thing that you do in the discussions, right? Make a claim, add evidence, and then provide analysis. And then, as always, to respond to two classmates by agreeing and or disagreeing. And then in each of your responses, you should be adding evidence that differs from the evidence that you offer in your original post, that supports your claim for agreeing and extending the conversation, or supports your claim for disagreeing. So that's the discussion assignment for this week. And so I'm just going to talk now. These are just the two bullet points that I have for what I'm going to talk about for this video lecture. I'm going to go over fences, and then, like I said, I'm going to talk about motifs versus symbols versus themes. So first, let's dive into fences. This is a 1985. It was written, but the setting is different from when it was written. So the setting is in 1957. It starts out in 1957, but through, I believe it ends in 1965. I'm just going to double check my notes. Yep, it goes through 1965. So very much going against Aristotelian concepts of how a play should work. So, and you were asked to read a little bit of Aristotle in a previous module. And because basically what Aristotle says is that plays should be represented in real time. So anything that is outside of, like, for example, this play, right? If you're watching this play and it's 2 hours long, that doesn't represent real time, right? You're witnessing days going by, sometimes months, and then you are witnessing years going by. So it's very against Aristotelian kind of, this is how drama should be. And people start to really play around that with as early as Shakespeare, and a little bit before that. But prior to kind of the Shakespearean and the early modern movement, you do have plays that are very strict about, this is what we are sticking to what Aristotle has to say about. But, if it's taking place in 2 hours, then the narrative of the play should encompass 2 hours of time, like what can actually happen in 2 hours of quote unquote real time. So the fact that as we get into these, and by 1985, we're in now what's called postmodernism. And by the time we get into postmodern writing, these are writers that are challenging everything about how a play should be written. You see this as early, right? So postmodernism challenges how drama is written. And it's not just drama, it's anybody, whether it's postmodern art, postmodern poetry, postmodern novels, postmodern drama, anything within the postmodern movement. But it challenges how drama is written, and experiments with different dramatic forms. But postmodernism isn't the one that really kind of sets it off, right? This real challenges to dramatic form arguably take place during modernism. And modernism, well, it generally starts around 1901 with the publication of Freud's interpretation, I think it's called Interpretation of Dreams. It's his first publication. But 1901 is this big marker in the humanities in terms of when a movement changes, or when humans start to do things or think about things in a different way. But the publication of Freud's Interpretation of Dream, what happens in 901, is usually what we say is modern. That's within the modern movement. And the modern movement really goes through the end of, and these are always arguable, but just to give you an idea, but the end of World War II. Some people argue the end of World War I. Some people say it's during the war, but just to give you kind of an idea of what we're talking about in terms of the mindset of people who are creating human artifacts like literature. But so modernism is this kind of 1900 to roughly 1950 period, and it could be a little earlier, like 1890s, and especially in Europe. But then from 1950 on, you get this kind of postmodern, because things change after the war. And so modernism first has these kind of challenges to views of humanity and, philosophical ideas of how humans should interact and exist, and, worldviews. And then after World War I and World War II, that changes again. So we get into postmodernism. And some people, in terms of what we're in now, I don't believe we're still in postmodernism anymore. I honestly believe in what's called, believe it or not, postmodernism. It can get a little bit ridiculous, but that we've moved beyond postmodernism. So I sometimes struggle when students talk about if you were to call Fences a modern play, you literarily would be incorrect because it's postmodern. So, and you also don't want to use the word contemporary. So sometimes students get confused about what if something's written in like 1985 or 2010 or 2015 or 1995. How do I refer to it? I always say just refer to it by the year, just refer to it by the century. Don't get into these words like modern, postmodern, contemporary, because contemporary really means that which goes along with. So if you said this contemporary play, it would be like, well, what are you talking about? Because contemporary means at a particular time. So you would talk about the contemporaries of postmodern writing or the contemporaries of modernism. So I would just say like this 1985 play or this late 20th century play, but that's kind of how you would want to frame it in terms of its temporality, just because there's all these different movements. That's just a little temporal context for what's happening, and that's because I had never read August Wilson before. This was my first time reading August Wilson because I don't dabble, and I never have dabbled in a lot of postmodern stuff. I love modernism because I'm a big Hemingway fan, and I'm a big Fitzgerald fan, and I'm obviously a big Freud fan. So I really love modernism, and I like postmodernism. I just haven't dabbled in it a lot. So I've only read a few plays written like after World War II. I've read a lot of poetry because I find war poetry to be really interesting. So when I read this, I was like, there's only 2 acts. I was very confused right away. I was like, this is confusing. Now I've read Death of a Salesman. That's a Arthur Miller, late 20th century or mid 20th century, and I've read Glengarry Glen Ross and a lot of David Mamet, and these are all postmodern texts that break from that 5-act kind of convention. That the 5-act convention is very instantiated, so it's a very common format to plays, not just in early modernity, but also throughout the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, and then by the time we get to the 20th centuries, you have people in modernism and postmodernism saying, we don't need 5 acts. We're going to have really long stage directions and very, very specific stage directions, which is what we see in August Wilson. And the 2 acts. So I was very confused by the 2 acts right away. That blew me kind of like a what? But I've read Samuel Beckett, Arthur Miller, David Mamet, all these kind of different postmodern and playwrights that, their whole play might be 1 act, going back to something like Antigone, right, which is 1 complete act that is implicitly separated by the chorus, but yet we don't really have that. We have now things being separated by stage directions. And we do have scenes, so we do have the scene distinction, but so Fences, I wasn't confused about it, but where some people might be more confused about reading Shakespeare because it's in early modern English. It's not in Old English, like some people have stated. Old English is, you can't read it. I've taken language classes in Old English. Old English is like Beowulf, if you've ever read Beowulf, like actually read Beowulf, not like the translated version. You wouldn't be able to recognize Old English. Then you have Middle English, just like Chaucer, usually the most common one read. And then we have early modern English, which is Shakespeare and Company. And then you have, it's usually called contemporary English, but there's another word for it, but I can't remember. There's all these different types of Englishes, and they're all, these are difficult to read. They take a long time to read through. This is really easy for me just because I've read it so long, but whereas I'm really, really used to reading the 5-act convention, early modern English play, reading Fences for me was very difficult because it is just the setting is very weird. The way they use the stage is very different. Um, the fact that it takes place kind of outside. There's like one setting for it, which I'm also like, this is weird. There's only one setting, and everything else kind of happens off stage. But it was more difficult for me to read. I mean, I got it, I understood it, I've been able to do analysis about it, but it was I finished it and I was kind of like, okay, I don't get it, but I've still been able to I've made some sense out of it, is what I'm trying to say. But where I'm trying to say, I know some people struggle with the older texts like Antigone and Shakespeare, but that's where it's easier for me. And reading postmodern drama for me is really difficult because I understand that the writers are trying to challenge conventions, and they're doing what's called pastiche, which is where they mix different conventions that you normally wouldn't mix together to create something new. And at the end of the day, it's when I'm done reading postmodern plays, I'm kind of like, I don't know why you did things you did. Like, what are the significances of them, or are there any significances of them? So I have a lot of questions as a reader. I think there's a movie that they made out of this with Denzel Washington. I hadn't I haven't fact checked that. I didn't watch it because I didn't want to watch it before I talked to you guys about it, but I probably will watch it just to kind of see what it's like. If you have watched it, let me know what you think about it. But anyways, let me dive into the play. Oh, and also, yeah, I was confused by okay, we started on in 1957 and then we end up in 1965. I was like, that's confusing. How can so much time pass on the stage? And it made me think about how ingrained I was in this very kind of conventional playwriting, where even though they were going against Aristotle in the early modern period, they were still sticking to really regimented conventions. So even just the fact that we have this time frame that is kind of extensive for a play, I was confused. Not confused, just like, oh, okay, our protagonist is dead now. Okay. And we didn't see him die. I'm okay. So I'm gonna get into the story now. I feel like I've talked a little bit about it, but I had a lot of kind of reflective practices after I read this. But so let's talk about our characters first. We have, and I may get some of the names wrong because, like I said, I've never seen this play performed on stage. If there is a movie version of it, I've never watched the movie version of it. But we have Troy Maxon. He is arguably our protagonist. Arguably. It's always an argument. He starts off as a 53-year-old man, and we have his wife, Rose Maxon. So she's Troy's wife. She's 7 years Troy's junior, so she's a little bit. Sorry, not 7 years. That's somebody else. She's 10 years. She's 10 years younger than her husband. So she's a little bit younger because we know that Troy has been married before. And then there's Jim. I don't know if it's Bono or Bono. I'll probably call him Bono just because it's easier to say. But this is Troy's, it feels like his best friend, but they've known each other a long time. They were in the penitentiary together for like 15 years, which is a really long time. So they've known each other a long time, and Jim has he's a big part of the story, so he just doesn't come every now and then. We have lions. I didn't know if it was Leons or lions, and then when Gabriel, the character, started calling him King of the Jungle, I was like, okay, I'm going to call him lions then from now on. So that's how I'm pronouncing his name. But he is Troy's oldest son from Troy's previous marriage, and I believe Lyons is about 34 years old when we meet him, and then presumably gets older as the play crosses time on stage. Then we have Gabriel, who's known as Gabe, not Gage. And this is Troy's brother. And Troy's brother, who is a World War II veteran, and he has a metal plate in his head, and we learned this in a stage direction, and he believes he is the Archangel Gabriel, and he carries a trumpet that we see him play a little, or try to play a little bit at the end. So we have Gabe, who, you know, they talk about how, you know, he had half his head blown out in fighting the Japanese, and he clearly has some psychiatric conditions because of whether it's a combination of PTSD and the fact that he's had a brain injury, or if it's just the brain injury. It's clear that you know, something as Gabe came back from the war, definitely not the same person. And then we have Corey, who is Troy and Rose's son. And Corey, when we meet him, is in high school playing football. And then we have Raynell, which we don't get a lot of Raynell because she comes later in the play, but she is Troy and Alberta's daughter that Rose ends up taking care of. So those are all our characters. So we don't have a lot, which is good, because I'm used to plays that have like 35, 40 characters, which is common in early modern plays. So that's one good thing about reading postmodern plays, is you get few characters a lot of times in one setting. So we have the setting. I don't think it ever says explicitly, but I'm guessing that it's Pittsburgh, and that's because Wilson famously is from Pittsburgh. I've only been to Pittsburgh one time, and they have a theater named after him there, and everything is August Wilson. So I'm guessing that it takes place in Pittsburgh. And they talk about kind of people from the South coming up to this area. So we have this sense of geography that they're not in the South, but they're also not, they're not further north than that either. So I'm guessing the setting is Pittsburgh, though we don't hear a lot about Pittsburgh. We hear about, I think it's like the backyard of the Maxons' house is the primary setting that we get. It's the only setting that we have throughout the entire play. And okay, so that's the setting. So yeah, it takes place in Pittsburgh, but like it's such a non-thing in the play. Like if I were analyzing this play in terms of the role that Pittsburgh has and like the significance of Pittsburgh in this play, I'd be like, I don't think it has much. And I think that's reinforced by the fact that it never comes up in the play. But we do get a lot of description about the backyard of their house, and this is where one of the many kind of ideas of fences comes up. But that's our main setting, is the backyard of that house. So, okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about what happens in the play itself. I'm just going to do like I did with Midsummer. I will just do kind of a basic kind of plot breakdown of, and I was trying to write plot as I went, and there's so much dialogue. It's such a dialogue heavy Like you don't get those long monologues. You get these kind of, you talk, then this person talk. It's Troy and Jim and Troy and Jim and Troy and Jim and Troy and Rose and Troy and Rose and Troy and Rose, and you're like, oh my god, they're talking about so many things. So I was first writing down like all of the descriptions they were talking about, because they provide a lot of information in their dialogue about things that happened before or outside of the confines of the narrative offenses. So I had to stop doing that because it was just taking me a really long time. And so I just kind of went with the blanket kind of, this is what is happening in the play. Although we get a lot of information from these characters about things that happened that that do affect the characterizations within the play, but I wasn't about to write down every little bit of historical detail about the characters. But some of it is important for understanding kind of what happened, like in particular, Troy's relationship with baseball. Like, we don't see any of that in this play, but we hear a lot about it. It was baseball, 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 to the point where I was like, stop talking about baseball so much. But it is important to the text, which is why one of your prompt questions for the discussion is asking you specifically, it doesn't ask you to talk about baseball, but it's saying like, hey, sports motif is prominent in this play. What's another motif? So, and baseball is a motif in this play. It's not a theme. It's a motif. So, I'm not going to say it starts out in the backyard, because the play starts out in the backyard, and then the entire place is set in the backyard of their house. So we first hear about Troy's job, in that he complained that only white people were driving, and they use the word colored people because I do feel uncomfortable saying it, so I'm referring to what the text says. And colored people were doing the lifting, and I inferred that these were garbage men. I think I'm right. I don't know completely, but they talk about picking up rubbish. And so the idea is that there are these people who drive the truck, right? And then there are people who, how they used to do, I don't know if anyone still does that, but how they used to ride on the back of the trucks, pick up the trash, put it in the truck, and then get back on the truck to ride, and then the other people would just drive. So Troy, it opens with this kind of, Troy's very kind of grandiose. He's very proud of the fact that he, said, hey, why do you only let, the white people drive and everybody else has to do the lifting, right? Which I presume he means picking up the garbage cans or picking up the piles of garbage or whatever they're picking up and putting it in the truck. And then he gets this meeting with the commissioner that he has to go in and kind of talk about this. So that's kind of the what it opens with. And then we get some background information about Troy's time in the hospital when he had pneumonia. And he had this, fight with death, like the Grim Reaper kind of figure. And he talks about that a lot. And the Grim Reaper character, or Grim Reaper, I'm not sure what I would identify the Grim Reaper as, probably a symbol, but, or it could be a motif. This is where motif and symbol can get confusing. But you might say the Grim Reaper is a symbol, but death is a motif. But that idea of death is definitely prominent throughout the play. Troy talks a lot about his interactions with death, death with a capital D, rather than a lowercase d. And then he talks about, his father when, before he left his home, he says that, he saw the devil's eyes in his father. So he definitely has a lot of quote unquote interactions with death, capital D, whether they're true or whether it's him hallucinating or whether it's him having it in his mind, or, that's up to interpretation. So I kind of figured he was kind of a drunk. So I feel like he's making some stuff up out of this state, but that obviously is an argument and could be argued against very easily. So after that, we're introduced to the character of Lyons, and Lyons comes to ask Troy for $10, and we get this sense that Lyons visits Troy every time Troy gets paid. And so there's this idea that Lyons is kind of a leech and he's not doing really well in his life. And, Lyons is a musician and is constantly asking for money. And Troy is kind of like, oh, why don't, Troy obviously isn't very happy about it. And then Rose kind of badgers him into eventually giving Lyons the $10. And then in this time when this first time that Lyons comes to talk to his dad, Troy, we get another long story where Troy talks again about an interaction with death with a capital D when he bought the furniture for the 3 rooms, and how he pays $10 a month to that day, because even though he paid off the rooms, he's worried that his transaction was with death. So he tells this long story about how this salesman can, but even before the salesman comes, like, Troy was thinking, like, man, I got this house and there's no furniture in here and everything's awful and I don't like it. And then, like, the day of or the next day, like, the salesman comes and it's like, knock, knock. Hey, I think you need 3 rooms of furniture. Like, what? Like, it is a little bit fortuitous that happens. But, and so then the next day or whenever, however long, the furniture is delivered for all these rooms, and Troy pays the $10 every month. And he was so weirded out by this coincidence where he thought about it, and then somebody just happened to come and give it to him, that he was like, this must be death. I'm just going to pay every month because, a little superstitious, right? If I stop paying, like, I'm going to die, that type of thing. So we get another story about that. Then we're introduced to the story, or the character of Gabe. He enters, and we get some information about him. This is where they kind of explain to us about his history, and that Gabe, and we get a lot of background. A lot of this play is kind of just giving background about the relationships between the characters and what has happened. But Gabe used to live with Troy and Rose, and then moved in with Miss or Mrs., I can't remember, but Miss Pearl. And Gabe thinks Troy is mad about this, so we get that information. That Gabe kind of wanted to live on his own, so he moves in with this lady, and Troy's like, I don't care if you live on your own, but this lady charges too much, like, she's taking advantage of you. So money comes up a lot in this play, because we have the situation about, how much Gabe pays pays to live at Miss Pearl's. We have the story or the anecdote about where to shop for groceries, and Troy is like, oh, you should shop here, even though it's more expensive, like, you get better quality, and they give me a tab, even though I can't pay for it right away, versus, Rose is kind of like, I don't know why we should shop there, we should just shop at, the A&P, and where it's cheaper, and so that, they get into a lot of arguments about money. And then we also get the story eventually of how Troy came to get his house, and that Gabe was given, I think it was $3,000 for his war injury, and Troy took this and bought his home for he and Rose and their family. And Troy did this, and Rose agrees with him that if Gabe had taken the money, because he was in the psychological state that he was in, like, he would either misspend it, or he didn't have the cognition, the appropriate cognition to be able to use that money for the best of his ability. So Troy kind of steps in and says, I should take this for you. And then he buys his house, and then he has Gabe live with him as well. So whether or not you think Troy took that money, that $3,000 for his war injury, whether or not you think Troy did that, and was a good thing, or you thought it was a selfish thing, that's up for interpretation. I tend not to like the character of Troy. That's just my own personal rating of him. So anything Troy does, I'm kind of like, I don't agree with you. So, you okay. So I don't know. I have very conflicting feelings about Troy, mostly because of the way he talks to Rose. But I know that this also takes place in 1957. So, and then we have, there's the conversation also that Corey has the conversation with Troy about getting its television set, and versus having the roof tarred. And I believe the TV costs, I think it's $200, right? So this is another money conversation. So Corey is like, hey, Dad, when are you going to buy a TV? And, it only costs about $200, and yeah, it's expensive, but you can pay like a little bit at a time. And Troy is kind of like, look, if I have $200, like, I need to get my roof tarred because, come winter time, we're going to have snow on the roof, and it's going to leak through, and it's going to ruin the TV anyways, because all that snow and water are going to drip on it. So he kind of has this conversation with his son about how you should spend your money. So they don't get the TV. Okay, so then essentially what happens is, like I said, there's a lot of conversation about like stuff that happens, but the narrative itself is really short, like in terms of a plot. Most of the play is these kind of random anecdotes that don't really further the plot. They further character development. They further the relationship between the characters. They further things like theme and motifs, but they don't really further plot. The plot itself is super simple. The plot is basically like, and I'm trying to go through the plot, but even when talking about the plot, I'm talking about these things like none of this has really the plot is Troy has a job. He complains about it. Then we find out that Troy, after talking to the commissioner, gets offered the job of a driver, even though he doesn't have a driver's license. It just made me continue to not like this character. So the plot is basically like, he complains about a job, he gets the job. There's all this stuff happening outside of that with his family that do the work of developing themes, developing character, like I said, developing dynamics between characters. But it doesn't really have anything to do with the plot. And then there's this kind of subplot of Corey being recruited as a football player for college, and Troy refuses to let Corey play football. He wants him to work at the A&P, which I believe is a grocery store, and kind of keep his nose clean. And the reason he doesn't want Corey to play again has nothing to do with plot. It has to do with the development of these other kind of literary elements. But Troy doesn't want Corey to play football because Troy believes that because Corey is black, that Corey won't ever get to play, something like that. Because this is what happened, potentially, depends on how you interpret it, to Troy with baseball. So Troy was apparently an amazing baseball player, but could never get recruited into the major leagues, or the major league. Now, a question here, which is, I think, left open to interpretation based on what you pull from the text. Was this because of his race or his age? And some people would argue that he couldn't get in because he was black. Some people might say, like Rose says, look, you were like in your 30s or potentially even 40s. I can't remember the exact age, but he was old to be recruited as an athlete. And we think about the ages of athletes. So she's like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, the reason you didn't get recruited is because of your age. Like, by the time, and this is where race might have something to do with it, but like by the time that major league, I don't know the word for it, but like teams, I guess, by the time teams were recruiting persons that were not just white, Troy may have been too old at that point. So it could also be a combination that before, right, I think he talks about playing with the Negro Leagues, but because the major leagues were only recruiting white people, so by the time they got around to recruiting people like Jackie Robinson, and we get a lot of names of, people who are black or from the Dominican Republic, so when they start recruiting people of, or Puerto Rican, people who are of different ethnic descent, by the time that happens, Troy is too old. So whether it's because of his race, because of his age, or because of both, those are both, all reasons why Troy is kind of like stomps on Corey's dreams of playing football in college. Also in going to college, whether it's playing football or not. So that happens, and then we find out that, Troy, I can't even remember the order of these things sometimes because it's such a mishmash of a narrative, but there's a few things that happens up until the end that are kind of central to the plot, and one of those is Corey leaves eventually. We later find out he joined the Marines, and that's because he comes to a real impasse with his dad about, I want to do this, you don't want me to do this, I can't stand it here, like, why don't you like me? They just don't like, they just have problems, and so Corey kind of leaves. And then Rose finds out that Troy has been seeing Alberta, another woman, and Alberta is pregnant. Rose, not happy about that, obviously. And then Alberta dies, giving birth to Raynell. And Rose, at the kind of behest of Troy, decides to care for Raynell, but considers Troy, and I think she calls him a womanless man. So she's kind of like, I'm done with you. I'm going to take care of this child because I've always dreamed of being a mother, and this is just another chance for me to do it. I kind of get like a second chance at it. Because her only child at this point is Corey. Like, Lyons is from, like, Troy has 3 children, but they're with 3 different women. Rose has 1 child, but then kind of adopts Raynell as her own. And Lyons, by the time she meets Lyons, he's older, we presume, when she first meets him. So she didn't have much, she wasn't in his life during his formative younger years. Then it fast forwards to 1965. Troy's dead. And everybody kind of gets back together. And goes to the funeral. We find out a few things about people. This is where we find out that Corey's a Marine. Corey and Raynell kind of meet for the kind of first time. And Lyons is, I don't know what he's in because they're not specific, but Lyons got in trouble for cashing bad checks, I believe is what happens to him. And so he's kind of doing time. But for some reason they let him out to go to his father's funeral. So Lyons is continuing to have a problematic life. He wasn't able to make it as a musician. We find out that I don't know if it was his wife or his girlfriend, I think Bonnie, they separated 4 years ago. Raynell is 7 years old at this point, so she has grown up, and we hear about how Troy died, how he was standing in the yard, obviously with the baseball bat, and he went to swing it, and he just kind of fell over, and that's how he died. So that's the end of Fences. I feel like I could talk, like, there's, and that's why I keep talking about the plot of this is really difficult because there's so much I didn't talk about. We didn't talk about Troy's history, which we get a lot of information about how he left home very young, and then he walked for 200 miles and, was homeless, and then he killed somebody, and then he was in the penitentiary for 15 years, and his relationship with Corey, how that's really problematic, and his relationship with Lyons, and his relationship with Gabe, and because, I was thinking about talking about penitentiaries, but that goes into something else. But the other thing that we didn't really talk about is Fences. But I'm going to leave that because I'm now going to get to talk about, and I've got some information on here about motifs, symbols or I just have motifs and symbols because I think theme is a little bit easier when compared to motifs and symbols. But if we think about the idea of fences, so because that's anytime I read something, I always go back to the title and I'm like, why is this thing called what it is? Because titles are always really important. Unless you're reading like Shakespeare, then titles didn't matter then, so they were just informative. Versus plays like this, it's fences obviously is going to have some type of symbolic, metaphorical meaning to it. So, and it's going to be the same when we read poetry for the next few modules. But you always want to think about, well, why is this thing called what it's called? So, the fences, we have the discussion of fences in the play because Rose wants Troy to build a fence around their house's backyard, I believe. But Troy is neglectful of this and is very slow in completing it. But he eventually completes it, mostly because I think of a bet he has with Bono, right? So they make this bet that's like, Bono's like, my wife Lucille, she really wants a new refrigerator. If you finish that fence, I'm gonna buy my wife this new refrigerator. So they kind of have this bet going. So whether it's because of the bet or not, I don't know. It's arguable. I don't even know if I believe it. That's why Troy finishes the fence, but he eventually gets to it. He's really slow about it. And we hear about it here and there. It's not a real prominent something that we hear about, but because the play is called Fences, we have to think about the fence. There's this literal fence, but then there are a lot of metaphorical fences throughout the play. So, what are the fences? So, and if we think about in terms of themes, what this can mean, I think one of the main themes is this idea of barriers, which is what a fence is. So, is this play about barriers? What is this play saying about barriers? But all of the characters arguably are faced with barriers, and their characters are developed in different ways by how they react and respond to those barriers. So, for example, Troy, all of them, arguably, but has the barrier, but particularly Troy because we hear about it the most, of his race. So his racial background can be argued as a barrier that keeps him out of being in the major leagues. He has the barrier of poverty. So poverty works as a fence that keeps him in, right? It keeps him, because fences demarcate, right? They create borders, which sometimes you can cross and sometimes you can't if we're thinking about metaphorical fences. So there's poverty, which works as a barrier in terms of social and socioeconomic mobility. So we hear about him being, poverty, not just poverty, but homelessness. And then we have the penitentiary, which is a more literal barrier. But he was there for 15 years. So that is a long time to be in that. But the barrier of race is not just related to his relationship with baseball, but it's also related to his work life, because that's the question he brings up to his boss, right? Is why are only the white people driving and the quote unquote colored people doing the lifting. So he sees that race, or he sees that as a barrier, and he's able to surmount that barrier, and he's offered the job as a driver, even though he's not qualified. He doesn't have a driver's license. Talks about how hard can it be to drive. So there's the penitentiary. There's the family. So a family can be a barrier because it can prevent people from doing things, or if you cross or transgress in any way, it can problematize the nature of the family. So, and that has to do specifically with Alberta and Raynell. So Troy transgresses the barrier of his family and sleeps with Alberta, sleeps with this other woman, and she gets pregnant, and now he has a third child from a third woman. So his family's a barrier, and then when he tells Rose about it, Rose is like horrified, and he's like, this is just what the situation is. Sorry. So it's almost as though he doesn't recognize the family as a barrier as much as Rose does. So, and, Rose views the family as a barrier in a different way from Troy. So they see the family in different ways because Troy talks about how, like, yeah, like, you're a great wife and everything, but, when I'm with Alberta, I'm able to, like, be me. And Rose is kind of like, whatever. What about me? Like, I gave myself to this family, and I don't do that. Like, I just sacrifice, and I don't complain about it, or I don't go, you don't think I haven't wanted to go out and, get to quote unquote know other men. But I recognize my family as a moral boundary, and to some degree a legal boundary. So it creates problems for them. And Rose is the one who asks for the fence to be built. And I think it's Bono who says it. But it is alluded that Rose wants the fence built to keep everything she loves. I wanted to say in prison, but it's kind of what it feels like. I don't know. There's times when I like Rose, there's times when I don't like Rose, but this idea of keeping everything together, like, I'm going to put a literal barrier around this house and around this family. Even though a family is a barrier, a house is a barrier because it has walls and doors, and the yard is a barrier because, ostensibly you own it. Even with all of those barriers, I'm still going to put up an actual fence because, maybe she's that insecure about her family or her life that she feels the need to do this. There's a lot of different ways that you can interpret that. So, and then the other characters have some other barriers as well. So, for example, Gabe, he has the barrier of being a wounded vet, which keeps him in a certain, or keeps him confined to being a certain way. So the fact that he was wounded in World War II and he has got this, metal plate in his head, this, it's now a barrier for him. Whether it's barrier, the word barrier and the word fence sound very different. Like, fence sounds very innocent and barrier sounds very bad, but they're not necessarily bad or good. It just depends on how you interpret them. But how you see Gabe's barriers, because is up to you, because there's also a lot of discussion about whether Gabe should be in a hospital for his condition, and that's another barrier. So the I presume what is a psychiatric hospital for Gabe, and Troy talks a lot about, like, I don't think he should be in a hospital, like, whatever. He fought for the country. He got wounded. He's not hurting anybody. And Rose is like, oh, I don't think she maybe should be in a hospital. And then Troy eventually signs some papers, and he can't read. But he eventually signs some papers that say that Gabe is going to go in a hospital. So the hospital also is this kind of conversation and symbolic barrier / fence, that metaphorical fence that gets brought up in a lot of ways as well. And related to that, in an even kind of more extrapolated way, is the gates of heaven. So we get a lot of references to how Gabe thinks he's the Archangel Gabriel and works alongside St. Peter at the gates of heaven, you know, quote unquote, judging who can enter and who cannot. So the gates of heaven are another fence, right? It's another kind of barrier into a place, right? And only certain people are allowed in. So that's another metaphorical fence that's brought up. And then there's other ways you could take this. I don't want to do this forever, because I could go on forever, because this play has a lot in it. But like Lions obviously has metaphorical barriers, and you know, the barrier of being a musician, the barrier of the fact that he has poverty issue or money issues, which naturally creates barriers. And later he is imprisoned or jailed or something for cashing those bad checks. And then Troy is a barrier for Corey, because Troy can't get recruited without the signature of his father, and Troy refuses to do that. So Troy functions as a fence or barrier for Corey, and then Corey ends up leaving and ends up joining the Marines, and the Marines arguably are their own kind of barrier or fence in a way, because they are a contained unit, right? So then Corey kind of fences himself in within this within the discourse of the Marines. And right now, I mean, just extrapolating, I could say that her shoes are a barrier because if we're talking about containment, she doesn't want to wear the nice shoes to Troy's funeral because they hurt her feet. They confine or contain her feet too much. So they work as a metaphorical fence or metaphorical barrier for her. That's kind of just thinking about different types of ways you could do that. But other themes besides these kind of metaphorical fences and fences as a theme, or the other one that actually I asked my husband about this because he's a big sports fan. So, but fences in baseball, right? So my husband was like, well, you know, the thing that surrounds baseball fields are called fences. And I was like, oh, okay. So that was kind of news to me. But, right, what contains a baseball field is called a fence. And so this idea that a home run can transgress or go beyond the fence. And and then it goes on its containment. So it transcends or transgresses, however you want to identify that. But because we get a lot of baseball metaphors in this, a lot of things about striking out, and there's tons of baseball metaphors. I was having a hard time following them because some of them I knew, but there is references to hitting a home run, right, and the ball kind of going past the fences, that it's able to leave its contained area, and therefore transgressing, or whether you see transgression as an evil act or a movement toward freedom, again, is how you interpret it. It's not set in stone. Just a few other themes that you could talk about with this play, besides this kind of barriers, containment, transgression, freedom, metaphorical fences and fences, confinement, right? There's, you have the theme of disparity, you have the theme of failure, you have the theme of family, but there's everything I've just kind of talked about all has to do with themes. If we go down to talk about then what are motifs versus themes, so motifs, most importantly, contribute to and reinforce a theme. They're sometimes called this thematic element because they are working to reinforce a theme or themes. Right, so in a literary work, a motif can be seen as an image, sound, action, or other figure that has symbolic significance. This is where it can get confusing with, well, what is the difference between a motif and a symbol? And contributes toward the development of a theme. Because here, right, sometimes motifs are mistakenly identified as examples of symbols, but probably most importantly are going to be this idea that the motifs contribute to and reinforce the theme, but also that the motif is this, again, like I talked about before, and that's talked about in your assignment for this week, is that it's a recurrent image, idea, or symbol. Again, symbol, confusing, that develops or explains a theme, while the theme is a central idea or message. So if we go back to these idea of themes, if we talked about, okay, the theme for this play is barriers. That's the central message. Okay, a motif of that could be, there's a few I'm thinking I could choose from, you could talk about fences as a motif because arguably that's a recurrent image throughout there. But penitentiaries could be it, poverty, right? Any of those things that I talked about what I just talked about are doing the work to support and contribute to the idea of this larger message of barriers. Same thing with the theme. If you did a theme of confinement, right, you could talk about jail, penitentiaries, anything that's fenced in or contained, anything that's like that. And within that, you would have symbols, right? So within that are symbols, a symbol of the fence as being a theme, or a symbol that supports the idea of this theme of confinement. So I did put down here symbols, right, which we've talked about in the past, you guys have written about in the past, but it's this idea of using an object or word to represent an abstract idea. That's always hard for me because I'm a post-structuralist, everything for me represents an abstract idea. So symbols are really hard for me because everything is a symbol. Everything right here is a symbol because words, by the nature of being words, are a symbol. So I'll get philosophically and post-structurally bogged down in a black hole of, well, everything's a symbol. Words are symbols. Letters are symbols. Commas are symbols. Everything means something else, right? There's this endless kind of representation or endless kind of deference to this represents this, represents this, represents that, and that drives me crazy. So symbolism, while it drives me crazy, we can talk about it without it driving you guys crazy, hopefully. But it's a symbolism isn't necessarily recurrent. It might be something that comes up like once or twice, versus, a motif that isn't necessarily representing an abstract idea, although it could, but recurs throughout as a way to inform or contribute to the theme. Right? Emphasizes key ideas or themes or motifs. Like the baseball bat could be a symbol. And that symbol could support, because the baseball bat is recurrent. But the baseball bat could represent an abstract idea. So again, it's all in your interpretation of what something is, which is where it can get extra confusing. Okay, so Fence's simple plot, but also very complicated plot because of so much happening, and there's a lot of areas that you could talk about to analyze, and a lot of places for open interpretation. But I think I've talked long enough. I know I said a while ago I was going to stick to 20 minutes, but talking about these things are lengthy, and I want to make sure that because I'm not there in person that I'm at least modeling how you might analyze some of this stuff or thinking about some of this stuff, and then making sure that I'm providing instruction on these things like motifs that give you a little bit of information, but they don't necessarily give you robust information about that thing. So otherwise, I will be grading essays this weekend. If you have questions for me, please let me know. And I'm always available to talk. But otherwise, I hope everybody has a good rest of the week and weekend. And I'll talk to you guys soon. Bye-bye.